The salt stings at her raw, chafed wrists, each tug of the ropes ending sharp pulses through her skin. Isabella Ferrante, 26, feels the weight of the Mediterranean on her cracked lips. The waves rocking her battered bones, then the prayers of the 43 women in prison with her below deck. 7 days have passed since they were ripped from their beds in Vest. Once, Isabella had been the proud wife of Marco Ferrante, a prosperous fisherman whose boat brought in half the village's catch. She was a woman who balanced household finances, raised 2 daughters, but attended Sunday Mass in the church where her parents, and as before them, had wed. Now she's a broken shell, crouching in the hold of a Barbar corsair ship. Her nightgown torn and stained with blood, both her own and Marcus marked her as a captive, stripped of everything but the rag she wears. The corsair's brutal examination on the beach left scars on her body. That choice of who would be taken and who would be left to die made clear in their actions. Her daughters Sophia, 8, and Lucia, 12, are somewhere aboard the ship, but she has seen them since they were separated on the beat. The hatch above opens, sunlight blinds her eyes, and a voice that's haunted her since that night calls down. The corsair captain, Hamid al-Rashid, speaks in Italian, his accent betraying a familiarity with these raids. The merchant's wife, the one who fought, bring her up. The buyers want to inspect before we dock. She doesn't resist as hands pull her onto the deck. Resistance has its price, and she's already seen the cough. Lucia had tried to throw herself overboard on the 2nd day. They made an example of her, breaking her spirit before casting her into the sea, dead and unclaimed. The bright light on deck blinds her further. When her vision clears, she sees the coast of North Africa for the first time. White buildings rise above a harbor. Minarets pierce the sky. A city that will be her prison, perhaps her grave. Algiers, Hamid announces with cold finality. The slave capital of the Mediterranean. By nightfall, you will belong to someone else. Her voice shakes. My daughters? Where are my daughters? The children are valuable, he answers coldly. They'll be sold separately. Young girls adapt better than women. They forget. They learn the language. They become useful. You cannot protect them. You cannot save them. They are merchandise now, just as you are. The sooner you understand that, the easier your transition will be. But Isabella's heart doesn't listen to him. She has to know, has to see them. Later, she's cleaned, scrubbed down, dressed in a simple garment to be paraded before the buyers. She knows this is how shall be sold, categorized for her value whatever remains of it. She's no longer a wife or a mother, she's just another piece of property. And somewhere in this ship, her daughters are being prepared the same way. The system that Isabella is about to be immersed in has been kept hidden for centuries, buried under a veil of shame. The European slave trade is well documented, but the other side, the barbarian slave trade, is a history that has been erased. From 1500 to 1800, Barbary corsairs raided the Mediterranean coasts, taking over 1 million European captives, reducing entire villages to ruin. It was just a few raids here and there. This was state-sponsored terror, and it left the shores of Spain, Italy, France, and even Iceland barren. Entire populations were wiped out. Isabella's story is just one of millions lost to history. She learns of this system, how women like her are categorized by beauty, by skills, by health. Women who are valuable are sold to wealthy buyers who will treat them well, who will maintain their health for the sake of their investment. The others, those who are older or damaged, are sold to labor camps or households where their suffering will go unnoticed. Their value diminished over time. But Isabella refuses to be just another piece of merchandise. She pushes for information. She needs to know where her daughters are, what has happened to them. Where are my daughters? She asks again over and over, bargaining for scraps of truth. She learns they've been sold separately. Lucia to a merchant, Hisson Alfed, Sophia to the household of the day. The merchant is better, kinder. Sophia, on the other hand, is lost to the world of political power. But Isabella does not lose hope. She fights for any piece of knowledge, any scrap of information, any lead that might allow her to reunite with them. The Rance and Ming priests, who operate across Europe to rescue Christians from captivity, may be her only hope. They work through complicated channels, making sure to obtain information that could be used to ransom captives, but they are often overwhelmed with the number of people needing help. Still, Isabella fights for her daughters against a system that has robbed her of everything, and she does not give up. not for herself but for them, for their survival, for their future. And when the moment comes, when the ransom is raised, when the funds are collected, when the negotiations are made, Isabella's determination will not be in vain. But even as she achieves freedom, as she escapes the nightmare of captivity, the question remains, will she ever truly reunite with her daughters? Or has time and the system itself broken what they once shared? For years, Isabella remains dedicated to ransoming others, helping the redemption priest raise funds, advocating for captives, and tirelessly working to right the wrongs of the past. She even manages to ransom her younger daughters Sophia, but Lucia, having lived and married in the household of Hisson Alfed, cannot be returned. Isabella tries, but Lucia chooses her new life, her new family instead. It is the hardest choice she will ever make. Isabella Ferranti lived on for 30 years after her return. She never remarried, but she made sure that the stories of the women like her, the ones who survived the barbarous slave trade, would not be forgotten. Her daughters' futures would be shaped by what she did. For them, for their survival, for hope. The history of the Barbary corsairs, the forgotten history, is still one we must remember. It is time we learn the truth. The truth that has been hidden for so long. The truth that we must choose not to forget. Isabella's life after her return to Vist was anything but ordinary. For the first few months, she focused on her physical and emotional recovery, seeking solace in the church and our community as support. The survivors of the raid, the families, the friends welcomed her back. Though the years apart had transformed everyone, Vist was not the same village it had been. The raid had ravaged its people, and the pain of the missing was etched into the faces of the living. Yet, amidst the sorrow, there was a quiet sense of gratitude. Isabella was home, but home was not enough. The fire that had kept her alive during her captivity, the fight for her daughters, burned brighter now than ever before. With the redemption priest still working diligently, Father Miguel helped Isabella understand the intricate world of ransoming, how funds were raised, how negotiations were executed, and most importantly, the complex dynamics of the market she had once been a part of. Though she had secured her own freedom, Isabella knew her fight was far from over. The lives of other captives like the ones she had met in the house of Ahmad ibn Saul still hung in the balance. Each day was a battle, not just for survival but for justice, for the truth to be acknowledged. She began traveling, raising awareness, speaking at churches, and advocating for the redemption system that had saved her life. Her voice became the voice of the silenced, the women who had suffered in the shadow of the corsairs' raids. She dedicated herself to the very mission that at once seemed like a dream too far from reach. But each step she took was weighed down by the knowledge that her daughters were still far from her. It was a slow process. Father Miguel kept in touch with her, offering updates on the political shifts in Algiers, the changes in the day's household, and the progress of negotiations for Sophia's ransom. And through it all, Isabella never gave up. She never stopped working for them, for the family she had lost in the future she desperately wanted to reclaim. After 5 years of tireless campaigning, Isabella received the message she had been hoping for. Father Miguel had succeeded. Sophia was finally freed. The ransom had been paid, the last of the funds raised by the community of Vist. Isabella's reunion with Sophia, though deeply emotional, was not the one she had imagined. Sophia had grown. She had changed. The little girl Isabella had lost on that fateful night was now a young woman, fluent in Arabic, converted to Islam, and deeply embedded in the culture of Algiers. The daughter she had dreamed of saving was now part of a world that Isabella had once hoped she would never be forced to witness. Sophia had built a life there, one that included a husband, children, and a family she had forged in the heart of the land that had stolen her from her mother. Isabella stood face to face with a girl who could not recognize the woman standing before her, the mother she had once known. Isabella wept. She wept for the years they had lost, for the life that Sophia had lived, a life shaped by the hands of others, a life shaped by the hands of others, a life shaped by survival. But the reunion was bittersweet. Sophia was free, and Isabella knew that, though their paths had diverged in ways she hadn't expected. Sophia was alive. She was safe, and that was enough for now. But Isabella didn't give up. She fought for the release of others, for the system to change, for a future where women like her, like Sophia, wouldn't have to endure the horrors she had suffered. She became one of the most passionate advocates for ransomed captives, spending her remaining years raising funds, gathering support, and helping women in need. As for Lucia, her story remained one of loss. Despite Isabella's relentless efforts, Lucia had made a life for herself in Algiers. She had married, had children, and, in her own way, found peace. But when Father Miguel reached out to her years later, it was to tell Isabella that Lucia had chosen to stay in the life she had built, the life that had given her a new identity. Isabella's heart broke all over again, but she understood. Lucia had made her choice. She had built something from the wreckage of her past. She had become part of a system that Isabella had tried so hard to escape. And as much as it hurt, Isabella knew she could not force her to leave. Her life after that was a quiet one. Isabella never remarried. She focused on her work, on advocating for the women who had been taken and lost. She continued to raise funds for ransoms, continued to support the redemption ist priests, and made it her mission to ensure that no one forgot the history of the women who had been stolen from their homes and forced into the most brutal of circumstances. She spent her final years in Vest, where she passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 56. She was buried next to her parents, near the church where her journey had begun. The village had recovered from the horrors of the raid, but Isabella's story, her struggle, was far from forgotten. Isabella Ferranti had survived. She had fought for her daughters, for justice, and for the lives of countless others who had been taken by the corsairs. In the end, it was just survival that mattered. It was the fight to give others the chance to survive too. Her legacy lived on in the work she had done, in the lives she had touched, and in the women who, because of her, found a way out of captivity. Her story was no longer forgotten. It was remembered. And in that remembrance, perhaps the greatest victory of all was won. Isabella's legacy, though rooted in grief, transformed into a powerful beacon for the women whose stories had been ignored for centuries. Her work didn't stop with her own return to Europe, and it was confined to raising the ransom for those held in captivity. She sought to change the narrative entirely, to bring the dark and forgotten history of the barbar, i.e. slave trade, into the light, a history that had long been suppressed, buried by the powers that had once benefited from it. Her efforts reached far beyond Vest. She spoke to communities across Italy, raised awareness, and educated those who had no idea that the Mediterranean, with its blue waters and warm sun, had also been a breeding ground for some of the darkest chapters of human exploitation. She was an advocate, a voice for those whose lives had been defined by captivity, but also by the small glimmers of hope that persistence, community, and love could bring. Her relationship with Sophia, though fractured and complex, evolved over the years. As Sophia grew older, she began to understand more about the mother who had fought so hard for her, even from the distance of a life that had been forcibly reshaped in Algiers. At first, there was anger, resentment. Even Sophia had changed, had become a product of the environment she had been raised in. And it was hard for her to reconcile that with the woman her mother was striving to be. Isabella knew this and gave her daughter the space to process what had happened. But as time passed, something softer began to form between them. Sophia visited Isabella in Vest, though the visits were brief and strained. They spoke cautiously at first, as if learning to trust one another again. The distance between them, both physical and emotional, could never fully be bridged, but there was a mutual respect born out of the shared truth of survival, of having endured a world that had been far too cruel to them both. Lucia's choice to remain in Algiers was harder for Isabella to bear. Her daughter's refusal to leave the life she had built there stung like a fresh wound every time Isabella thought of it. But Isabella, too, understood that freedom, at least the freedom Lucia had found, was something different, something that couldn't always be measured by the standards of her old life in Vest. In the end, Isabella found peace with her daughter's decisions, however painful they might have been. She knew that the world had changed them in ways that she couldn't reverse. But their survival, in whatever form it took, had been her ultimate victory. After her passing, Isabella Ferranti became a symbol of resilience, an inspiration for those who had suffered in silence, and an advocate for justice in a world that often turned a blind eye to the atrocities of the past. Her name was passed down through the generations of Vest, and eventually, through historical societies that sought to understand the full scope of the European slave trade and the suffering it caused. Schools taught her story, and her journey from captivity to freedom became a touchstone in the fight for recognition of the forgotten victims of the Corsair raids. Her work also gave rise to a new wave of redemptionist efforts. Fathers, mothers, and communities across Europe, who had never heard of the ransoming priests, now knew of their work. The networks they had built, the lives they had saved, became more visible, and the global awareness of this dark history spread. In the distant corners of North Africa, the echoes of the barbar, i.e. slave trade, continued to reverberate. Families were still trying to reconnect with lost loved ones, and while many had been absorbed into a new life, Isabella's story was proof that survival was possible, even when the system seemed designed to break them. And as for Isabella's own future, it was one that she had built from the ashes of her past. Anne Emery remained a symbol of defiance against an impossible system, a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable odds, a single person's will to survive could spark a revolution of change. Her story was no longer forgotten. It was remembered. Isabella's story, once buried in the shadows of history, began to spark a movement. Her aim became a rallying cry for those seeking to understand and rectify the horrors of the barbar, i.e. slave trade. As the years passed, the historical landscape shifted. Scholars previously hesitant to confront the uncomfortable truths of European enslavement were now compelled to investigate and expose the full scale of the violence that had been wrought upon entire populations. Isabella's own work continued long after her death. A foundation dedicated to her aim was established by those she had inspired during her lifetime. This foundation worked tirelessly to raise awareness of the forgotten histories, conducting research, offering support for those whose families had been lost in the course of raids, and advocating for reparations and recognition from governments and institutions. The story of the Mediterranean slave trade, with its intricate networks of raids, ransoms, and systemic brutality, slowly took its rightful place within the broader context of global slavery. Through the foundation, Isabella's legacy was kept alive. It funded new ransoming efforts, supported survivors, and helped reconstruct the fractured lives of those whose families had been broken by the raids. It also ensured that the descendants of those taken during the barbar by a slave trade were given a voice, whether they were descendants of those ransomed or of those who had never made it out. Sophia, now grown and with children of her own, became deeply involved with the foundation in her later years. She carried her mother's fire forward, albeit in her own quiet way, while she had chosen to remain in Algiers. Deeply integrated into her new life, she was fiercely protective of her mother's memory. Sophia became a symbol of the complexities that Isabella had always understood of a child who had been torn between two worlds and who, in the end, had created her own path forward. Lucia's life, too, continued on its own trajectory. Although Isabella's attempts to ransom her had failed, Lucia's life was not one of hopelessness. She became a successful businesswoman in Algiers, her role in the merchant's household growing as she married and had children. Though her identity had been shaped by the circumstances of her captivity, Lucia had found a sense of agency and autonomy that Isabella had long hoped for her. She never returned to Vest, but she often sent letters to Isabella, telling her of her life, her children, and the changes in Algiers. The bond between mother and daughter, once strained and ruptured, had found a more distant, but no less significant form of connection. The survivors of the barbar raids, though scattered across the Mediterranean and beyond, had found ways to come together. There were communities that held reunions in various cities, where families that had been separated were reunited or at least exchanged information. Many of them were part of the same network that Isabella had helped create, and their descendants began to learn of the true scope of their ancestors' suffering. It became a movement for justice and healing, for righting the wrongs that had been inflicted on them, and for ensuring that future generations would know their histories. And so, as time moved forward, the history that Isabella Ferranti had fought so hard to expose was woven back into the fabric of European consciousness. The shame that had once silenced it began to dissolve as the truth emerged into the light, often in painful and complicated forms. But through this truth, a new sense of solidarity and compassion grew, one that united diverse communities, both those who had suffered and those who had once turned a blind eye. The legacy of Isabella Ferranti lived on, not just in the people she had saved or the system she had fought to dismantle, but in the generations of women and men who learned her story and understood the value of remembering what history tried to forget. It wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about recognition, about justice, and about the strength to rewrite the narrative of the past that had sought to bury its own victims. Her name, once whispered in the darkest corners of the Mediterranean, was now carried with pride by the children of survivors and by the foundation she had founded in the hope that history could finally be set right. And as long as her story was told, Isabella Ferranti remained more than just a captive, more than just a mother or a survivor. She was a symbol of resilience, a beacon for those whose lives were shattered but never entirely lost, a reminder that the human spirit, when faced with the darkest of circumstances, could always find a way to reclaim its light. The forgotten history had been reclaimed. The women, their stories, and their suffering had been remembered. As Isabella Ferranti's story continued to echo through the centuries, a new generation of historians, activists, and survivors emerged, inspired by her unwavering determination to reclaim a history that had been silenced for far too long. The foundation that had been established in her and aim grew into a global movement, advocating not only for recognition but also for restitution. Communities that had been victimized by the Barbary slave trade began to demand acknowledgement from governments and institutions that had long ignored or actively suppressed their stories. Isabella's own life had been one of persistent survival, and in her death, she became a symbol of endurance for countless others. Her story resonated across national and cultural boundaries, transcending the confines of a single moment in history to represent the broader human struggle against oppression. The foundation, now led by her descendants and allies, worked with educational institutions to ensure that the history of the Barbar, i.e. Chrysaores, was included in academic curricula worldwide. This inclusion marked the beginning of a wider reckoning with the global scope of slavery, one that had often been centered on transatlantic trafficking, but now also acknowledged the horrors that European women, children, and entire coastal communities had suffered at the hands of North African Corsairs. Through the Foundation's efforts, archives of redemption ISD priests, long minus hidden in the dusty corners of church vaults, were open to the public. These documents revealed the detailed testimonies and accounts of the barbaric systems of slavery that Isabella and others had been subjected to. These testimonies, once buried beneath layers of historical amnesia, were now brought to light, shedding light on the vast network of raids, auctions, and slave markets that operated in the Mediterranean for centuries. Isabella's journey from the desperate captivity in Ailers to the eventual ransom and return to Europe became the backbone of this new understanding. Her writings, along with those of other ransom captives, were carefully preserved and translated. Documentaries were made, based on her testimony and the writings of the redemption ISD priests, to share with the world the full extent of the trauma faced by European captives. The survivors, now living in the fading shadows of their once thriving coastal villages, began to find a collective voice, thanks to the groundwork laid by Isabella's persistence. Meanwhile, the descendants of those who had been taken during the raids began to come together for reunions. Across Europe, there were gatherings where families once torn apart by the Corsairs could meet, share their histories, and find connections to long-lost relatives. For many, it was not just a journey of finding family members, but of reclaiming an identity that had been erased or distorted. It was an act of solidarity, a step toward healing, and a profound act of remembrance. These gatherings were not just for personal closure, but also served as a public reclamation of stolen histories, a way of ensuring that future generations would never forget the atrocities of the past. The impact of Isabella's legacy also had a lasting effect on the way that Europe, and the world at large, understood the dynamics of slavery. The history of the Barbary Corsair trade served as a critical counterpoint to the often narrowly defined narrative of European involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. It served as a reminder that slavery was a global institution, one that affected people across the globe in different ways, and that all victims of slavery, regardless of their origin, deserved to be remembered and honored. As the Foundation continued to grow, it expanded its work into the realm of legal advocacy, pushing for reparations for the descendants of captives, especially those who had been left behind by the ransoming system. These legal battles were long and difficult, often facing strong opposition from powerful institutions that had long maintained the status quo. Yet the persistence of the survivors' descendants, inspired by Isabella's own strength, gradually gained traction. Governments that had once turned a blind eye to the demands for reparations were slowly forced to confront their histories. Courts began to consider the claims of the surviving families, offering them compensation for the traumas their ancestors had endured. Sophia, now in her 40s, continued to be actively involved in the work of the foundation. She had returned to Vist after many years, reconnecting with the community that had once helped raise the ransom for her and others' freedom. Though her relationship with her mother remained complex, their bond was undeniably strong. Isabella's work had been foundational not just to her own survival but to the survival of her family as a whole. And while their family's story was filled with loss and pain, it was also one of immense resilience. Sophia was determined to keep that legacy alive by continuing the work her mother had started, even if it meant facing new obstacles and enduring the emotional weight of a life she had never fully chosen. Lucia, now a woman of deep conviction, had made her peace with her past. She had a family, a life, and a new identity built in Algiers. Yet there was a part of her that always held on to the memories of her mother. Every year, on the anniversary of their separation, she would send a letter, carefully crafted, to her mother. She would write about her children, about her life, and about the strange blend of gratitude and sorrow that she felt for the woman who had once been her other and who was now a figure whose shadow loomed over her life, even from across the sea. But for Isabella, the true victory was not in what she achieved in her lifetime, but in the legacy she left behind. Her name would live on in the hearts of those who came after her, in the stories shared by the survivors who gathered to remember what had been lost, and in the foundations that worked tirelessly to ensure that the forgotten histories would never be lost again. Isabella Ferrante's life was a testament to the power of memory, the persistence of hope, and the unyielding will to survive. Her story, once hidden in the darkest corners of history, now stood as a beacon for generations to come, a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, the human spirit could endure, and the truth would always find its way to the surface. As the decades passed, Isabella's legacy became intertwined with the larger movement for justice, recognition, and reconciliation for the victims of the barbaric Corsa trade. The work she had started was no longer confined to the small communities of the Mediterranean, but had expanded to international advocacy, where her aim was synonymous with courage, survival, and the fight for lost histories. Schools and universities incorporated her story into their curriculum, especially in courses about the history of slavery, colonialism, and Mediterranean geopolitics. Documentaries and books about her life reached wide audiences, ensuring that new generations would understand the breadth of the trans-European slave trade that had once been swept under the rug. Through global campaigns, descendants of the women captured in the raids began to unite and form international networks of solidarity. They established organizations that pushed for more robust support for descendants of Barbary captives. These organizations were instrumental in shaping public policy and raising awareness about how the consequences of this forgotten trade still shape the lives of the affected families. They helped sponsor programs to assist with the documentation of lost histories and continued to pressure governments to offer reparations. Isabella's role as one of the primary survivors of this long-neglected chapter in history remained central in public consciousness. Her story was now not just one of personal survival, but a rallying cry for those who had yet to reclaim their own histories. Her tireless work and eventual success in securing her daughter Sophia's freedom continued to serve as a symbol of hope, a reminder that even against seemingly insurmountable odds, survival, perseverance, and the pursuit of justice could bring about change. While Isabella's final years were marked by her dedication to the cause, they were also marked by an increasing need for personal healing. The trauma of captivity, the separation from her audience, and the years of struggle had taken their toll, but her sense of purpose had remained unwavering. She had been driven by a desire to help others, those still suffering in captivity, those whose voices had been silenced for too long, and those whose histories had been erased. But in her quieter moments, she also allowed herself to mourn, not just for what had been lost but for the immense emotional toll it had exacted. Sophia, now grown, had taken over much of the leadership within the foundation. Though her personal connection to Isabella remained complex, shaped by years of separation and the trauma of captivity, she felt a deep obligation to continue the work that her and others had started. For Sophia, it was a way of reclaiming her own history, her own sense of identity. Despite the challenges of their fractured relationship, Isabella had given her a sense of purpose, and for that she was forever grateful. Lucia Toon had built a life in Algiers, one that reflected the stark contrast of her experiences. She had been given a new name, a new family, and a new life, one that Isabella could never have predicted. But despite her efforts to distance herself from the past, she found herself seeking out information about the survivors, about those who had fought to reclaim their freedom. Lucia knew that she could never fully return to the life she had once had envisioned. But she also knew that Isabella's work had opened the door to a future where stories like theirs were finally being told and understood. For Isabella's children, this meant something profound. They were part of a larger movement to reclaim their identities and honor the legacies of those who had suffered before them. Both Sophia and Lucia understood that they were connected not just by blood, but by the shared experience of survival, resilience, and the ongoing work of ensuring that the stories of those who had come before them would never be forgotten. As Isabella's passing approached in the early 1500s, the final years of her life were spent in quiet reflection. She had witnessed the monumental changes that her work had set in motion, changes that she had never anticipated when she had first been captured and sold. The movements for justice, the recognition of the history of the Barbary Corsair raids, and the support systems for survivors were now global. Survivors no longer lived in the shadows. Their voices were being heard. On her deathbed, surrounded by her family and those whose lives she had touched, Isabella Ferrante's legacy continued to shine brightly. Her final words were a quiet reflection on the life she had lived, the injustices she had witnessed, and the people she had fought for. "We survive for those who cannot," she whispered to Sophia, who held her hand. "We remember for those who are forgotten, and we fight for the future." Her passing marked the end of an era, but her spirit lived on, indelibly imprinted on the work that continued after her death. The fight for justice, for the recognition of lost histories, and for the redemption of the forgotten captives of the Barbary Corsair trade became an enduring movement, one that transcended Isabella's personal struggle and grew into a powerful global force for change. As the years passed, her name remained etched in the annals of history, not just as a survivor of captivity, but as a symbol of resistance, resilience, and the eternal fight to preserve human dignity against all odds. Isabella Ferrante's story, a tale of unimaginable hardship and quiet heroism, would never be forgotten again, and through her legacy, the world had learned to remember not just the history of the oppressed, but the strength of the human spirit that could never be completely broken. The foundation she had created, her tireless work, and the lives of those she touched ensured that her story and the stories of the countless others who had been silenced would live on for generations to come. History may have tried to forget them, but Isabella Ferrante had made sure that they would never be erased. As Isabella's legacy continued to grow, her foundation became a beacon of hope and action for the descendants of Barbary captives, ensuring that their stories too would never be forgotten. By the time of her passing, the movement she had initiated had led to a greater understanding of the complex dynamics of the Mediterranean slave trade, shining light on a chapter of history that had been buried in shame. Schools and universities across Europe and North Africa began offering courses on the transcontinental slave trade, the systematic erasure of captives' identities, and the subsequent fight for justice. The archives she helped to establish testimonies of survivors, redemption priests, accounts and documentation of the trade were preserved and open for public access. Historians from around the world could now study the intricacies of the raids, the lives of captives, and the networks that helped them survive. These archives, along with the testimonies of survivors who had worked with Isabella, became key to recontextualizing the historical narrative, showing that the victimization of Europeans in the hands of the Corsairs was not just an isolated occurrence, but part of a broader pattern of Mediterranean warfare, political turbulence, and economic exploitation. Isabella's efforts also led to the establishment of reparations programs for survivors and their descendants. Small but significant efforts were made to compensate those who had lost family members or were themselves caught in the violent upheaval of the Corsair raids. While full restitution was a monumental challenge, there was progress. Communities once decimated by the raids began receiving grants to preserve their cultural heritage, allowing for the restoration of homes, churches, and schools, while also providing scholarship opportunities for descendants of the enslaved. Throughout the years, her surviving daughter, Sophia, became a powerful voice for women and children caught in situations of captivity. Sophia's transition from a young girl in a foreign land to a formidable advocate for the enslaved was a testament to Isabella's influence on her. Their reunion, while bittersweet, had created a foundation of trust and shared purpose. Isabella had taught Sophia to never accept injustice, to always fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. Lucia's story, in contrast, had unfolded differently. She had found her place within her new life in Algiers. Yet there remained a part of her that longed to understand her past. Though she had made a life for herself, her connection to her mother remained a complex emotional landscape. Lucia's own children had been raised with the knowledge of their mother's past and the story of the woman who had fought for their future. She had shared with them the sacrifices Isabella had made, albeit in a way that reflected the distance between her life in Algiers and her mother's life in Italy. Lucia never returned to Vest but quietly supported the movement that her mother had championed, using her position within her husband's household to discreetly pass information and resources to those fighting to reunite families torn apart by the Corsair raids. As for the foundation, it continued to grow under the stewardship of Sophia, who expanded its mission beyond the Mediterranean region. She sought out survivors from other regions, unearthing the hidden histories of European slavery and the impact it had on families for generations. Sophia also focused on modern-day slavery, advocating for the liberation of women and children trapped in contemporary human trafficking networks, using the lessons learned from her family's history to inform her activism. Isabella's story had now reached the ears of governments, and though the historical injustices remained large and daunting, legislative efforts began to take shape in Europe and North Africa. The European Union initiated collaborative projects with North African countries to provide education on the historical realities of the Barbary course. Trying to address its long-lasting effects, efforts were made to provide resources for communities who had lost generations of men, women, and children, helping them rebuild in ways that were culturally sensitive, while also acknowledging the horrific legacy of the past. The descendants of survivors began to network, forming organizations that acted as vocal advocates for preserving the history of their ancestors and pushing for greater reparations. These organizations, like Isabella's Foundation, lobbied for the recognition of these lost histories in museums, schools, and universities. But despite the progress, there remained an unspoken truth that was difficult for many to bear. No matter how much the world remembered, there would always be a void, a space where the lost stories of the forgotten captives would never truly be filled. Isabella's own grandchildren, like Sophia's children, would live in the shadow of that void. And yet, even in that space of absence, they carried forward the legacy of resilience, defiance, and the unwavering commitment to ensuring that no one was ever forgotten again. Isabella Ferrante's name would never be forgotten, not just for the incredible work she did to unearth and memorialize the history of the Barbary Corsairs, but for the life she led, one of unparalleled strength, determination, and a never-ending pursuit of justice. Her story lived on in the movement she built, in the lives of her daughters, and in the collective memory of those whose lives were forever changed by the Corsair trade. As each year passed, new generations took up the cause, inspired by the woman who had once been a captive and then a fighter, a mother who had lived through unimaginable loss but never ceased to believe in the power of survival and the capacity to make change. Her life was the embodiment of hope, and in that hope, the future would always have room for justice. Isabella Ferrante had not only survived history, she had reshaped it, leaving behind a legacy that ensured that the women and children taken by the Corsairs would never be forgotten again. As the years turned into decades, Isabella's legacy continued to influence generations that followed, both in Europe and North Africa. Her foundation evolved into a globally recognized organization, uniting activists, historians, and philanthropists from around the world to continue the work she had started. Its efforts were no longer confined to just the Mediterranean or to the descendants of Barbary captives. It became a platform for addressing historical injustices, slavery, and the forgotten narratives of marginalized peoples across the globe. Sophia, now a respected elder, stood at the helm of the organization, but she had also found peace with her past. She had worked tirelessly to locate the remaining relatives of those who had been captured and sold into slavery, ensuring that their stories were given a voice. Through her, the legacy of her mother lived on. Sophia had adopted the mantle of advocating for the silenced and the unseen. Her work, alongside other dedicated individuals, created global dialogues about the transatlantic slave trade, the Barbary slave trade, and the plight of modern-day enslaved individuals. It opened the door for collaborative studies, where the historical context of slavery was studied in a more intersectional way, understanding that it was not a singular event but a series of intertwined systems that exploited human beings for profit, regardless of geography or ethnicity. The network of redemption ist priests that Isabella had once relied on also expanded, with Father Miguel's work immortalized to the written records he left behind. These priests, many of whom had been trained by Father Miguel, continued to engage in ransoming efforts, but also provided vital resources and information for the now-minus global abolitionist movement. Father Miguel's legacy became a touchstone for those committed to freeing captives from the Mediterranean slave trade, ensuring that future generations would never forget the lessons of resilience, resistance, and the power of community action. Though Lucia never returned to her mother, her contributions in her adopted home did not go unnoticed. The children she had raised, her family, now formed a bridge between the two worlds: Isabella's world of survival and resistance, and the world Lucia had built in Algiers, shaped by new values, culture, and relationships. They too became part of the extended family of survivors working quietly in their own way to preserve the past and safeguard the futures of those still caught in modern slavery. Isabella's legacy as an advocate for those who were enslaved began to influence social and political leaders. She became a symbol of how the oppressed could rise against seemingly insurmountable odds. Her story was now taught in schools, discussed in universities, and shared in documentaries that stretched across borders. Leaders from both Europe and North Africa visited her grave, marking it as a sacred site, a reminder that the past, no matter how painful, must never be erased. In the villages she had once called home, memorials were erected, not just for her but for all the women and men who had fallen victim to the coarser trade, and for the villages that had been wiped off the map, their histories lost in the mist of time. As memorials became places where people could come to reflect on what had been taken and to honor those who fought to retrieve it. In the Mediterranean, the stories of Isabella Ferrante, Fatima, Maria, and countless other women became part of the shared consciousness. The people who once viewed them as victims now recognized their power, their agency, and their immense contributions to the world. And so, as the years continued to pass, Isabella's name and her story remained alive. She had not only fought to reclaim her own life, but in doing so she had also secured the memory of all those whose lives had been forgotten. By the time of her death, she had seen the first seeds of a revolution take root, one where the forgotten histories of women and children in captivity were no longer silenced. She died surrounded by those who had carried on her work. In her final days, she reflected not just on the pain she had endured, but on the triumphs. Her daughters, both grown into women whose lives had been forever altered by the circumstances of their youth, had lived through their own versions of survival, shaped by their mother's resilience, each in her own way. In her final breath, Isabella knew that the story she had fought so hard to preserve, the truth she had dedicated her life to sharing, would never be forgotten. And that truth, carried by generations to come, would continue to inspire those who understood the value of remembering, the value of never letting the past slip quietly away. Her work, her voice, and her determination to fight for those who had no voice would be remembered for centuries to come, ensuring that the hidden history of the Barbary corsairs would always be told, that the sacrifices of those like her would never be forgotten, and that their legacy would inspire future generations to fight for justice, equality, and the freedom of every human being. Isabella Ferrante's journey through unimaginable horrors had transformed her into something more than just a survivor. She had become a beacon, a voice for those whose names had been erased from history. She had taken what was stolen from her, her freedom, her family, her identity, and used it to reclaim not just her life but the lives of others. In her later years, as she watched the growth of the movement she had inspired, Isabella often thought of the village of Vist, the place she had once known so well, the sounds of the fishing boats, the laughter of her children, and the quiet rhythms of daily life that had been ripped away in one night. She often wondered if, in some corner of the world, her daughters still remembered the warmth of her embrace. A relentless drive to reunite with them had shaped every decision she had made after her capture, and although she had not succeeded in bringing Lucia back, her work with Father Miguel had made it possible for Sofia to return to Europe. They were finally reunited to women who had once been torn apart by the brutality of slavery, each bearing the scars of their experiences, yet still standing, still alive. Isabella's legacy wasn't just one of survival but of reinvention. She had reshaped the lives of countless women, advocated tirelessly for the ransoming of captives, and exposed the dark corners of history that had been too long forgotten. Her death, though it marked the end of her personal story, did not signal the end of her work. She had built an network of support, one that continued to push for change and remembrance in her absence. And Emery lived on in the thousands of women whose stories were finally being heard, whose struggles and resilience had been recognized. She was remembered not just as a victim, but as a forsame other, a survivor, a fighter who never gave up on the idea of reclaiming what had been stolen from her. And in the decades to come, her name would remain synonymous with the fight for the rights of those who were lost in the shadows, those whose stories had never been told. Sophia, now grown, continued the work her mother had begun. She became an advocate in her own right, traveling through Europe, speaking to those who had never known the truth about the Barbary corsairs and the captives they had taken. Through her, Isabella's message continued to spread, her legacy woven into the fabric of modern human rights campaigns. Lucia, far away, had built a life that could never be truly reconciled with the past. She had married, had children, and raised a family, but deep within her, the echoes of her and others' voice and the memories of Vist lingered. Though she had chosen not to return to Europe, her decision was never an easy one. She had become someone different, shaped by the years she had spent far from the world she had known. And so, Isabella's story, her suffering, her survival, her quest for hard orders became the foundation for a movement that spanned continents, that gave voice to the silenced, and that ensured the forgotten stories of women like her would never fade again. Her life was a testament to the strength of the human spirit, to the power of hope, and to the importance of remembering the past. Isabella Ferrante had fought not just for her own freedom but for the freedom of others, ensuring that history would remember those who had been lost, erased, and overlooked. Her story ended, but the ripple of her impact would continue, spreading through the generations, inspiring those who would fight for justice, equality, and the freedom of all people, no matter where they came from, what they looked like, or what history tried to erase. The last words of Isabella Ferrante, as she lay on her deathbed, were simple: remember us. And in doing so, the world would remember that it was not the strength of one woman that had changed the course of history, but the persistence of a mother who refused to forget her children, and a survivor who refused to let the past slip away into silence. Her name would forever stand as a symbol of resilience, and her story, no longer hidden, would live on for as long as there were those who understood the true cost of forgetting and the importance of remembering.